Okay, welcome back. This is our last talk in this morning session. We have Jodie Burchell. She loves data, like she really loves data. So imagine what she's working as a data scientist in a client-side analytics in SIG Australia, and her favorite languages are Python, R, and Stata, or Stata, as you prefer. And she will be talking about reproducible research in Python. So please welcome her.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my talk today. There's obviously a lot of great selections to choose from in this time slot, so thank you for coming to mine. So today, obviously I'm going to be talking about a topic near and dear to my heart, reproducible research, and how well Python is set up to implement this. So obviously this is a very complicated topic. We saw some examples of how it can be implemented in the previous two talks by Nathan and Henry. So what I'm going to be doing is be giving a very high-level overview. But as you can see on that slide, I have a blog, and in the next couple of weeks, I promise, I'll be popping up a blog post which will show you how to implement this in a concrete manner. Also, I'm a really crazy cat lady, so there's going to be a lot of cats in this talk. So to start, let's define what reproducible research is. So you can see from this quote that the goal of reproducible research is to tie together specific instructions to your data analysis and the data that you used in order to make sure that the scholarship or the work can be recreated, better understood and verified. So, this is a very noble sounding high-level aim. But how do we actually apply it to our everyday work doing data analysis? Well, to understand what this quote is trying to say, I think it helps to first understand what irreproducible research is. And yes, that's a very awkward sounding word, so I'm extremely sad that that's the opposite of reproducible. So let's say we're going back to an analysis we did 6 months ago. We open up our Dropbox folder where we stored all of our files associated with our analysis, and it's a huge mess. You can see here that there are 30 different data files, and there are 7 Python analysis scripts which have an incomprehensible naming structure. I'm sure it made sense at the time that I did this analysis, but I've got no idea what it means right now. So let's open up what looks to be the most recent file, the very helpfully named life expectancy script final, 3 final, with the second final in capitals for good measure. So there's not really a lot of pointers here as to what I actually did, why I chose the data I chose. And it makes it really hard to pick up where I left off and actually be sure that I'm building on the research I did earlier. So in order to convert this piece of irreproducible research into something reproducible, we need to be able to answer 5 questions. What did I do? Why did I do it? How did I set it up at the time I did the analysis? When did I make changes and what were they? And of course, a very important step in kind of modern science, who needs to be able to access it and how can I get it to them in a really easy manner? So to give a bit of background for this talk, I'll be using a very simple example analysis. So I predicted the average life expectancy in around 150 WHO member states using publicly available data from the WHO website. And I've used a lasso regression approach. There's a few different predictors in this model, including chronic and infectious disease prevalence, death rates by violent crime, access to clean water and sanitation. So really cheery topic. But something that makes this a really nice case study for reproducibility is that each of the variables need to be downloaded from separate sources, loaded into pandas data frames, and then cleaned before they're merged into the full data file that you can use for analysis. So it makes it a really nice case study for something that needs clear reproducibility to be able to build again. So let's jump into how to convert our irreproducible analysis into something reproducible by answering our first question, what did I do? So one of the first things that can trip you up is working out where you got your data from. So you can see from this GIF that there's a lot of different steps in downloading data manually that are difficult to document, and you can easily forget them when you come back to your analysis. So you see there's quite a lot of different data sources even available on that one page. So the best way to get around this in Python is to include the data download as part of your script. So you can see here in this script up the top, I've used the pandas function read CSV to get Python to read in the exact URL that I want. So there's no ambiguity about the exact data source when I come back to doing my analysis later. So similarly, if you're using SQL to say get your data, you can include your SQL query with your Python scripts. Or if you're using something like MySQL, there's actually a package that allows you to run your SQL query directly from your Python script. Another try for reproducibility is editing data by hand. And I know it's really tempting, particularly when it's small and you convince yourself, I'll only do it once. It's never just once, we all know that. But it's really, really difficult to document, probably one of the hardest things to document properly. So you can see in this GIF, there's quite a few steps I've needed to take to reduce this messy data set down to the clean form that I need for my analysis. So I'm doing things like getting rid of rows and columns, not documenting which ones I've kept, and naming them with names that don't actually tie back to the original data set. So the obvious solution for this is to script any data manipulations. And of course, Pandas has been mentioned a lot in talks throughout the conference. It's a really wonderful package for data manipulation. And it makes it pretty straightforward to do all the standard tasks like subsetting, cleaning variables. So you can see in this script, I've written a function that keeps a subset of columns, keeps a subset of rows, and also cleans up any string columns that contain extra characters by stripping them out and converting the whole thing into a numeric. So now that this is scripted, we have a really clear record of what we did, so we know when we come back later. And it also makes it really quick and really easy to do it again, and most importantly for other people to be able to do it who are not familiar with our analysis. And finally, I think we've all been guilty of leaving exploratory code that we didn't end up using in our scripts. It's really kind of a pain when you get to the end of an analysis and have to clean up your scripts, particularly if you're under a lot of time pressure, like we all are, particularly at work. But failing to do so means it's super confusing when you come back and you need to replicate what you did. So for an example, in this analysis, I tried 2 regression approaches, a ridge regression and a lasso regression. And in my untidy script, it makes it really confusing to know which regression model I actually used as my final approach. So the obvious solution is a very boring one, but you need to leave behind a tidy script, like cleaning house, when you finish your analysis. Leave only the analysis in that report, in that script that you use for your final report or whatever your final outcome is. Okay, so now that we understand the what's, we need to document why we did what we did in our analysis. So as we all know, there's a whole bunch of decisions and assumptions you make when you're doing an analysis that you'll never remember when you're not in the midst of that project. So what sort of things are you not likely to remember later? Why did I use these data? Why did I pick these specific data transformations? Why did I use this modelling approach? And most importantly, what question was I even trying to answer in the first place? So one way we can document this is writing comments in code, obviously. So it gets the job done, but it's quite difficult to read. So you can see here, as I told you, there's a bunch of different data sets that you need for this analysis. What I've tried to do is document where I got them from and what subset I've kept in each, but it's pretty hard to digest that. So the solution to this is an approach called literate programming, and it's designed to get this around this limitation of comments. So again, from this quote, a literate program is an explanation of program logic in natural code, in our case English, which is interspersed with snippets of source code, in our case Python. So as many of you would know from this conference or your own work, Jupyter Notebooks offer a really nice way of implementing literate statistical programs in Python. So just to give an overview of you, although I'm pretty sure everyone knows what they are at this point, Jupyter Notebooks are documents that run in your browser, and they're really flexible. So as well as allowing you to include and interactively run chunks of Python code, you can include things like images, tables, and dynamic visualizations. For those of you who were here on Friday, there were some really nice interactive visualizations run in Python in Plotly. So you can see here an excerpt of a Jupyter Notebook I created for this life expectancy analysis. So at the top, there's a chunk of human readable code in Markdown. And because it's in Markdown, we've been able to exploit formatting features like titles and bullets that make it really clear what we've done. And then at the bottom is the accompanying code that actually goes with that explanation. So revisiting our data downloading example, let's compare side by side how comments look on the left with Jupyter Notebook on the right. So you can see on the right, what I've been able to do is explain where I got the data from in a nice, easy to digest paragraph, and then at the bottom, use the formatting features that allow you to do a table to list all of the variables in a really easy to read format. Okay, so now we've documented what we did and why we did it when we come back to it later. Now we need to work out how we get around our next trap, not remembering how we set up our environment when we ran the analysis. All right, so 6 months ago, we system installed our packages to run our analysis. At the time, we installed the most up-to-date versions of NumPy, Pandas, and Matplotlib. We ran our analysis using these, and everything worked beautifully. So now we come back to this analysis 6 months later, and things have moved on with all 3 packages. They're all now at different versions. So what happens when we go to run our analysis using these different versions of the same package? Well, depending on the changes that have been made between our versions, our code may not produce the same results, or it may not run at all. I think we all know this feeling. So luckily, as always, Python has a very easy and elegant solution called virtualenvs. So the way to think of virtualenvs is essentially being just like your global environment, but instead of just having one that affects all Python code that you run on your machine, you have many, they're disposable, and they're isolated from each other and also from the global environment. So you can see how useful virtualenvs are when you have multiple projects running that use different versions of the same package, because it means that you don't need to mess around in the global environment trying to downgrade or change the versions of packages when you're trying to run the next analysis. So I have heard that virtualenvs have a bit of a bad reputation when you try and run them directly from terminal. They're really apparently a bit of a pain in the butt to implement. But if you use a thing called wrappers over the top of your terminal, it makes it really easy. So I just want to give you a quick demonstration of how easy it is to set up virtualenv using my shell interpreter, which is fish, and its associated wrapper virtualenv. And I'm not doing a live demo because I was too scared. So we have a GIF. So to initialize the virtualenv, you simply type bfnew and the name of the virtualenv, in my case cats. So you can see I'm installing all the packages using pip, just as I would in the virtual environment. And it really is just that easy. So I just wait for that to all install. This is the awkward thing about not doing the live demo. Just stand here while the GIF is running. Fantastic. And when we do pip list, you can see that they're all there listed with the most up-to-date versions. So my understanding is I'm not an Anaconda user, but Anaconda also has its own virtual implementation. It looks like it's also very easy to implement. So if you're a Conda user and you're not using virtualenvs, I'd recommend reading up on how to do it because the benefits are really enormous for reproducibility. Okay, so of course virtualenvs work super well when you're running the analysis on your own machine. But what happens when you're using a different computer or you want to share your analysis with someone else? Well, it's really simple to bundle up the contents of your virtualenv using a process called freezing. And you can see there on the left, what I've done is just simply typed pip freeze and assigned the contents of my virtualenv to a text file called cats requirements. And you can see that there. So it's just a text file. It's really easy to store with all of your analyses, and we'll talk about using tools such as GitHub to keep track of all of your code. And all you need to do when you need to recreate this analysis is pop the contents of that frozen virtualenv in a fresh virtualenv, and bam, it's just ready to go. It's really easy. Okay, so in the process of creating this lovely, clean, well-documented script, we've obviously created a lot of code. And we don't need a lot of it, but we might want to keep track of what changes we've made, or keep track of snippets that we think will be useful for later, but we don't want in our final script. So how do we keep track of this in a nice, clean, reproducible way? So as I showed you at the beginning of the talk, keeping track of changes can be really messy. So as I said, I've got 7 different versions of the same file. And I really don't know which is the right piece of, I don't really know like how to keep track of bits of code I've written, what's useful, what I want to use later. So fortunately, there's a better way with a version control system called Git. And Git has an asterisk there because it's simply the version control system I'm most familiar with. I understand a lot of Python users also use Mercurial, also a valid choice. It all works in a very similar way. So what Git does is it allows you to take snapshots of your code at different points in time, and then allows you to compare changes you've made between different versions, or go back to earlier versions if need be. So to illustrate this, let's have a little diagram. So we have the current version of our working script. What we do with Git is we commit these changes to a local repo or repository, and this is essentially just a special type of folder that keeps track of changes that you make to your script. And we can also push this version to a remote repo in order to make sharing with others easier later, but I'll cover that in the next section of the talk. So, okay, we get back to our script and we make some changes. When we commit this version to our local repo and subsequently to our remote repo, you can see that instead of overriding the old version, Git treats the current commit as the latest version, but keeps track of the previous changes that have been made. So let's have a look at how this looks in an analysis. So for the life expectancy analysis, I made 3 commits, and I really should admit, this is far fewer commits than I should have made. It was not very good practice on my part. And you can see that with each of those commits, I've been able to make a meaningful message. In my case, the messages were not particularly meaningful. Started the script, finished the script, made some changes, but I would encourage you to exploit Git in a much nicer way than I have in this example. Even better, you can easily compare what changes were made. So here on the left, with the red, is the previous version of the Jupyter Notebook, and on the right is the current version. So in the previous version, we hadn't filled in the introductory text explaining what the analysis was. In the version on the right, we filled that in, and Git's just demonstrating the difference between those. So I should also say that it doesn't just apply to markdown text, this keeps track of changes in code as well. So we now get to our final step. Who needs to access our analysis, and how can we easily get it to them? So the traditional method of sharing documents that I used to use back in my academic job is involving attaching a Word document or code files to an email, sending it to relevant collaborators, and waiting for them to send back their changes. So if you're really lucky, what you might get is a Word document with track changes that you can merge, but otherwise you're manually putting in all those changes. So not only is this really painful, but it's also not easy to keep track of who made what changes and when. So, of course, I have a solution for you. There is a file sharing website called GitHub, and it's one of many code sharing websites. It's just one of the most popular and the one that I use. And what it allows is for collaboration between people who are working on the same projects. So GitHub has a bunch of different functions, but for this talk, what I'll talk about is how it can be used for simplified and, more importantly, documentable collaboration. So here we have our project remote repo, and it contains the current version of our analysis script. So I'm the owner of this repo, and I come in and I make a change to the script, as you can see here on the left. I commit this change, and I push it to the remote repo. As earlier, the current analysis script is now the one that I've just committed, but that remote repo is keeping track of all the changes that have been made. Now my collaborator comes in. She clones this remote repo to her machine, and she makes her own change, as you can see there on the right. So as I've given her permission to make changes to the repo, she can then push her changes and have them integrated with the script. So these now becomes the current version of the analysis script, and the 2 previous versions are stored. So an important part of collaborating using GitHub is that the contributions of every author are tracked. So this is really useful if you've got a collaborator that's made a change, you've got no idea what they did, particularly if they're not documenting properly. You can go to them and say, why did you make this change and what's up with that? So you can see that GitHub marks really clearly who's contributed what. So at the bottom, we have the latest commit that I've made to this project. And above that, the contributor, the change that my contributor, see Prieto there in the front row, made after that. Okay, so let's recap everything we've covered about reproducible research in Python. Okay, so answering what did I do, with an irreproducible approach, what we'd use is messy, untidy, in-progress scripts, or a lot of point-and-click steps that we can't document. With reproducible research, we use a tidy script, and we also make sure that we put as much of the analysis in code as possible. Why did I do it? Well, in an irreproducible research approach, we don't document the thinking behind our analysis. Whereas in reproducible research, we use approaches such as literate programming and tools such as Jupyter Notebook to document what we've done. How did I set it up? In an irreproducible approach, we'll load all of our packages into the global environment. Whereas in a reproducible research approach, we'll put them in a virtualenv and store those frozen requirements with our analysis. When did I make the changes? With irreproducible research, we'll have multiple scripts that we don't really know what's useful and what's not. With reproducible research, we use version control and make sure that we keep track of all the changes. And the kind of optional but extremely important step is sharing who needs to access it. In irreproducible research, we may email collaborators and manually integrate their changes. In reproducible research, we'll use co-sharing websites such as GitHub to make sure that we have documented changes and everything's easily integrated. So if anyone's taking a photo, just give them a second. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. Yeah, we have 10 minutes for questions, so.
Oh, 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you, that was a really good talk. I always struggle with version control with Jupyter Notebooks.
Yes.
I wondered if you have any advice. Do you keep your binary inputs and images in when you commit, or do you strip them out, or do you only use notebooks at the later stages of analysis?
Look, I don't tend to use notebooks for things that require anything but code and markdown generally. I do some blogging with Jupyter, and I have found that the way it handles images is a bit weird. So I guess I don't really have any advice because it's something to kind of avoid.
I want to continue on that. Why do you struggle with Jupyter Notebooks to keep them under version control? What? Okay, because in that case you can clear the output cells and then commit that probably too. Okay.
No.
Okay. Sorry.
Great talk, thank you. I imagine there's a number of coders, programmers in the room who don't consider themselves scientists and may not know the special problems that research scientists have. How can programmers who work on these version control tools and deployment tools improve your life for keeping track of this stuff when we don't? What special problems are there that we need to be aware of, and how can we solve them for you?
So I actually think a really good problem that's being raised is particularly in, I think, probably neuroscience and ecology and areas like that. There probably are a lot of images that are used. I think it's really difficult to keep track of changes to images. So that's one problem. I would say another problem is, well, it's not really a problem. I think the documentation around Git in particular is actually quite excellent, and it's very approachable for beginners. It does get really confusing though. I think maybe something that could be helpful is when you're dealing with many people who are working on a project and you've got problems with clashes, like two people make a change and they're basically incompatible. maybe some more advice around handling that, because I always struggle with that, to be honest.
So does everyone.
Solve it for us.
Hi, thanks very much. Excellent advice about scripting downloads and scripting data cleansing.
Yeah.
In reality, though, do you first do a manual download and then script it? Exactly the same with the data cleansing?
So I would never do data cleansing by hand unless I had no choice. It's simply because I just cannot remember what I've done. I think there is a case for downloading by hand, but it's if you expect those data to change rapidly. So something that I kind of forgot to mention is you should include the date that you downloaded your data, because obviously data changes. But if you need to be able to replicate exactly what you did, you should have a snapshot of that data, if it's on your computer or in a SQL database, depending on how big it is.
Sorry, just to clarify,
Yep.
I agree that we should script it,
Oh, yes, yes,
but often you're busy discovering data,
yes.
so you're looking around, trying different things, and then once you find the data, then script it. And similar with data cleansing, I was wondering, because it's really hard to script it before you've actually tried it.
Before you know what you've done. I think that's kind of the difference between your in-progress scripts and your tidy scripts. So, yeah, the exploratory stage is extremely messy. The code looks like crap. There's just bits of stuff that doesn't run, and there's stuff that you're never going to use. So I would probably, if you're playing around and you don't intend to reproduce those steps, that's okay. But if you need to know that you actually did download those things, I'd probably recommend scripting it and then deleting it, but have committed that you downloaded it as part of your version control.
Thanks for your talk. Sorry, I came in late, so I'm probably going to ask something that's already been covered in the talk. But it seems like, especially in the last slide, it leaves the process sort of halfway. So then there's follow-up. So after that, there's things like publication, peer review, and reuse. So I'm just wondering, is there some quality bar that things like Jupyter Notebooks, etc., need to be able to reach in order to be reusable by other projects? And how do you get over that sort of hurdle of reproducibility versus I need to clean up my script so that it's usable by somebody else, and now it's not what I actually ran when I ran the experiment in the first place?
So I think there's a couple of questions there. One's about the code that you used, if I understand correctly, so about the actual things that you did during your analysis. And one is about using things like Jupyter Notebook and pushing them in, say, journal formats. Is that right?
Yes, I'm assuming that the research is part of a chain where a lot of it actually gets passed on to either the next research group or the next university or somebody who doesn't necessarily have human contact with you, and so everything has to be explained in the documents, and therefore, and especially with respect to peer review, everything all of your methodology is now not in a methods paragraph at the end of your text, but is actually in these extra documents that publishers are still finding novel and aren't necessarily able to cope with yet. So do you have any strategies for coping with all of that sort of stuff? Refactoring, making things presentable, and still making it actually representing the research that you actually did?
So full confession, I really only started doing reproducible analysis after I left academia. So my academic practices were pretty much textbook terrible. That's how it was so easy for me to produce the irreproducible examples. I guess probably I would say that there's a difference between, each document needs to be built for a purpose. So there's a difference between the scripts that you would pass on to another research group compared to what you'd pass on to journals. And I would say probably designing the script for the purpose, as much detail as needs to be known, in order to reproduce it, but nothing that's in there that's confusing. So you could say if you've tried out a bunch of different approaches and you know they're going to ask you about it, I don't think you put that in code. I think you mention that in the text, but that's, I think, probably a subjective thing. In terms of Jupyter Notebooks and journal outputs, I've got no idea, like in terms of whether you can convert. Panda? Can convert it. Okay, cool. Looks like there's a solution.
Thanks for the talk. Do you have any advice on the change management, rather changing the culture of your organization? Probably something that you faced. What steps you took to move away from a culture of just hacking together some code into actually building a reproducible research environment? This is something I'm struggling with, and so I need some help with that.
Another full confession, we're not kind of at this point in my workplace either. This is the ideal. I think probably encouraging organisations to actually have access to private GitHub repos is probably a really good first step. But I think a big part of reproducibility is about allowing just that extra time budget, which can be a big ask, but making sure that they're actually making the time to let you go back and tidy everything up, letting you actually have the time to think things through and make sure your analysis is thoughtfully documented. How to get managers to do that? That is, I do have a PhD in psychology, but that's a mystery to me.
Okay, thank you, Jodie.
Thank
Once
you.
more time.